Hi, I'm Marcy Winograd. I am co-chair of the Peace in Ukraine Coalition based in the United States, which was launched by Code Pink. I'm also an organizer for Code Pink, a women's-led international anti-war movement. Anyway, I want to thank the organizers of the Peace Institute of Slovenia for inviting me here today to share with you some of what we are doing in the United States to oppose this proxy war, this US-NATO proxy war with Russia. I was asked to define the war, what I view as the war, and our coalition, Peace in Ukraine, which represents about 100 or more organizations, most of them within the United States, but also some in Europe and also in Latin America. We see this war, as I mentioned, a proxy war between the United States and Russia for global hegemony, for global domination. And some of us see this as a route to a war with China, to weaken Russia, to then go after China, which is so frightening. And we're working hard to oppose that as well at Code Pink. We have a China is not our enemy campaign. Do visit us at codepink.org. In terms of the war in Ukraine, we see this as a war that was really provoked by the United States and NATO. Certainly as far back as 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO. And now we see 31 countries when it was 12 countries that were part of NATO with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. So the expansion of NATO, we see that as a provocation. We see this as another provocation as the 2014 coup, in which our own Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who's now number 3 in the Biden administration's State Department, going to Ukraine in 2014 to pass out pastries, to make trouble, really, and to engineer the transition government. We heard that on the phone call that was taped between her and Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine from the United States. Beyond that, we feel that this was provoked by other factors. One, arming the nationalists in the civil war that was triggered following the coup in 2014. We also see provocations with the United States installing ABM missile sites in Romania and Poland that could be outfitted for first nuclear strikes. We know that the Biden administration, President Biden himself, has gone back on his campaign promises to embrace a no first use of nuclear weapons. And his nuclear posture review, which encapsulates his nuclear policy, says that the United States reserves the right to use nuclear weapons if the interests of any of our allies are threatened. So this obviously was very threatening to Russia. This is not an excuse for an invasion. Our coalition opposes the Russian invasion. We're clear about that, while also acknowledging the many provocations. I was also asked to talk about the role of the United States and NATO, which I think I probably covered in what I said previously, but right now, the role of the United States is to arm Ukraine. 50 billion and counting in weapons and military training. That's out of about $115 billion that we have already allotted to Ukraine in the past year. Some of that humanitarian aid, a lot of it weapons. This is a profitable enterprise for our military contractors. I try never to call them defense contractors. This is not about defense, right? It's about militarism. So they're making a bundle, as are the oil companies. I think we can guess who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline. Yeah, that's something that our press has basically completely ignored. You cannot find an article in the traditional corporate media that tells us the truth or even explains what the great journalist Seymour Hersh wrote on Substack about the United States plotting with Norway to sabotage the pipeline and release about 300,000 gallons of liquefied natural gas, methane gas into the ocean, an ecological disaster. So our coalition, our demands are, we want a ceasefire. We want to see major de-escalation, a ceasefire. We want diplomacy and not one more penny for militarism, for war in Ukraine. This is just fanning the flames of war. This is not reaching any kind of agreement. any kind of security agreement that would address the concerns of all stakeholders, it's really just a boondoggle with no clear end in sight. I do have a sense, however, that a ruling elite in the United States may be split on this war, or may be increasingly fractured, because we just recently saw Victoria Nuland, who was in the Maidan Square in 2014, causing all sorts of trouble. She recently, a few months ago, she went to Asia. Why? To court the neighbors of China, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. Why would she go there? To prepare for another US proxy war. This is what is being talked about in Washington with a straight face. They're very serious about, deadly serious about this. We recently saw the chair of our Joint Chiefs of Staff testify before the House Armed Services Committee in Congress to say that war in China is not inevitable. Well, I hope not, but to say that we must prepare for war with China in order to avoid war with China. And to that end, some of us believe, many of us in the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, that this proxy war with Russia is really about weakening Russia. As our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, a former board member of Raytheon, as much as said, this is about weakening Russia for another aim, and that aim is to go after China. So we're at Code Pink. Again, China is not our enemy. We're focused on this, and we want to stop all sorts of legislation aimed at vilifying China and the Chinese, including the latest one is the Restrict Act, which would basically give the Department of Commerce, one of our cabinet level departments, carte blanche to censor social media platforms, including TikTok. So what are our demands? Our main demands are no more money for the war in Ukraine, no more money for military, for weapons. We want President Biden to pick up the phone, call Vladimir Putin, and arrange to meet with him. We think it's outrageous that our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who is really just sitting on the back bench of the War Department, that he met with Lavrov, his counterpart in Russia, for 10 minutes to talk not about the war in Ukraine, but other matters. So perhaps there are some diplomatic efforts underway that we are not aware of, but by all means, the US public should be made aware if there are such efforts underway. So we'll see what happens in the next few months. Our tactics, our strategies, we recognize there is no silver, pardon this expression, there is no silver bullet to ending this war in Ukraine. However, we need to create a mass movement, not just to challenge endless militarism, endless war in Ukraine, but to also challenge this preparation for war with China. So what are we doing? Well, at the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, we've organized several weeks of action, and these involve street vigils in highly trafficked locations with signs. On our website, we offer all sorts of resources under the resources tab. That's peaceinukraine.org. Ceasefire now, that's one of our signs. And we also urge people to organize delegations to visit their members of Congress. I stood at my own farmer's market collecting petition signatures for a ceasefire, for diplomacy, for an end to weapons shipments. And then we delivered those petitions to our Congress member, our House member. We also urge people to protest in front of these representatives who are continually voting for more weapons. And we've had some big protests. We had one in Washington, D.C. recently, March 18th. And we had one in Los Angeles. I was at the one in Los Angeles in front of CNN, which has had an endless parade of generals to talk about how to win the war in Ukraine. We know, the Peace in Ukraine Coalition knows there is no military solution. We need a solution that addresses the security interests of all stakeholders. Some of us feel that NATO not only should not be expanded, but should be abolished and replaced with some sort of architecture for an international security agreement. And we believe that we want to encourage nations to be non-aligned, not aligned with NATO. We saw the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And we believe that NATO, which has been responsible for wars, attacks in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Kosovo. In so many places, we believe that it's very dangerous, right, to surround any nation such as Russia with a hostile nuclear alliance. So we see some of the challenges. I will talk about some of the challenges as well. Those challenges include uniting people who want peace, because unfortunately we see some in the United States, as we see in Europe, who have traditionally been part of the peace movement, who now are supporting sending more arms to Ukraine. And certainly the Democratic Party, of which I'm a member, has been in the forefront of pushing for arming Ukraine. And the Republican Party, one of these major votes, there were at least 57 Republicans who voted against sending weapons to Ukraine, but they also voted against sending humanitarian aid. And some of them said, we want to save our weapons for the war with China. So this is a bipartisan war, and we need more people with us, and we're writing op-eds. That's another strategy we've adopted. We're trying to get letters to the editor. We're doing a mapping of the media to see where the opportunities lie in a media landscape that is so dominated by hedge funds, who are ultimately the owners of some of the big cable news networks. So op-eds. Also, we have a Democratic Party convention. We have two major parties in the United States. We also have third parties, but two major ones, and those are the Republican Party, which I just mentioned, and the Democratic Party. I'm in California, and we'll have a Democratic Party convention for the state next month. And so some of us plan to be there with our signs, chanting, with our flyers. We have lots of flyers on our website, peaceinukraine.org. And we're going to flyer some of the caucuses at this political convention. There's a labor caucus that usually draws between anywhere from 300 to 400 members of the labor movement. And we think it's really important in our messaging to tie no more money for war in Ukraine to fund the urgent needs at home, urgent needs for housing, for healthcare, for education, for climate. So that's how we hope to resonate with more in the labor movement. And we see the support of the labor movement and people of color as integral to building a mass movement to challenge endless war perpetrated by our own government in our own name. We cannot abide by this any longer. So we invite you to join us. We host Peace in Ukraine Coalition meetings twice a month, the first and third Wednesday of the month. It's at 3:30 Eastern Time. So visit us, sign up at peaceinukraine.org, and we look forward to seeing you on our calls and hearing about your protests in the street. And we stand in solidarity with all of the work that you in Slovenia, in Europe, and the rest of Europe, in the global South, all over the world, those who are challenging war, we need to stand together and stand in solidarity. So thank you so much, Peace Institute of Slovenia, for inviting me here today. Remember to visit us at codepink.org and peaceinukraine.org.